This episode of Around the Layout is brought to you by NERX, the northeastern region of the NMRA's virtual convention. Tune in Monday, March 18th through the 21st as the NER delivers a fantastic lineup of how-to clinics, roundtable discussions, and layout tours right to your screen. Be sure to check out the amazing work in the model showcase and tips and tricks, short video segments showing modeling tips that don't fit into a full clinic. NERX, it's like being at a convention without leaving your home. For a full schedule, check out their website at nerx.org. Hello, everybody, and welcome to Around the Layout, where model railroaders come to tell their story. My name is Ray Arnott. So glad you could join us. Joining us on this episode, Alan Whitaker. Alan, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, awesome to have you. And I think Chris Palmieri is going to start charging me like a finder's fee for guests because he's been sending me such great folks, and you're one of them who have kind of fallen under the home shops projects and, you know, within that family. And he said, you got to talk to Alan. He's got a great story to tell. And he hasn't led me wrong once. So I kind of, in Chris Palmieri, we trust. So Here we go with yet another guy that's got that home shops tie with a freelance railroad, and really excited to get to know you a bit more and learn about that freelance railroad.
Yeah, absolutely.
How did this whole model railroading thing start for you?
Well, as a kid, I grew up in East Tennessee, a little town called Jellicoe, Tennessee, which is 60 miles north of Knoxville. I was raised by my great-grandparents, and they actually rented a apartment to a Southern Railway crew. And how that journey began, my love for trains. When we would drive into town, we'd see those guys waving at us at the railroad crossing. They would work I think it would be like a turn local. They would come out of John Sevier, out of Knoxville, lay over in Jellicoe, spend the night at their apartment that they rented for my grandfather, go load the train the next day, come back, lay over in Jellicoe again, then take the train on to Knoxville. So I always loved seeing the Southern Railway stuff as a kid. And one day he took me out to our church out in Fairview, Kentucky. And train pulls up and they stop. And he's like, all right, boy, get on the back of that caboose.
Oh,
so, hey, I'm like 5 years old at the time. I'm like, oh, happy joy here. So I got to ride about 1.5 miles on the back of a train and got off at Jellicoe Yard and went on home. And I was pretty much hooked from there. But being in a railroad family, I had 2 great uncles, 2 great grandfathers, and a great great grandfather that worked on the railroads. So kind of runs in the blood. In 2000, I hired on with CSX, moved to Columbus, Ohio. And since then, I've had a very good career with them. Went full-time union 4 years ago. So I've seen a lot of different operations over 24 years, a lot of behind-the-scenes stuff that a lot of people don't get to see or experience, which, I'm very thankful for God for allowing me to have that experience. But when I moved up here in 2000, one of the guys I worked with, Benny Adams, he was the engineer for CSX and Conrail before then. And I worked on the former Conrail side. And he is from a place in Western Virginia. And he's like, well, you're a hillbilly, so you're okay in my book. I got 2 boys around your age. Why don't you come down to the Model Train Club and hang out with us? So I became a member of the Columbus Model Railroad Club, which was off Parsons Avenue. So growing up where I did, not a lot of people were into the hobby. If you wanted to meet somebody in the hobby, you'd have to travel an hour south to Knoxville or Oak Ridge, and that's where the hobby shops were. You had Dan's Trains, and I can't remember the name of the other place, but it was in Oak Ridge, and that's where all the model railroaders were. So I didn't have a lot of influence on, hey, what's a prototype railroad, other than what I read in magazines. So that little bit there, I was always interested in the model trains. So I started collecting at age 14. My grandfather gave me like $10 to buy a model railroader and a railroad model craftsman at this bookstore that was next to the place where we had church lunch. And I was just hook, line, and sinker. I don't know if you recall when Athearn released the Jeep 60s, the blue box. You had the Norfolk Southern Operation Lifesaver and the SP version, and their photo ad hooked me right from the start. I'm like, man, I really want to do this stuff. This scene's just too cool. So, fast forward back to moving to Columbus, I buy these models. I take them to this club. I've got the wrong horns on it. I've got the wrong ditch lights. Everything's just totally wrong. And some of these rivet counters, prototype modelers, they're about ready to stroke out on me. And they're like, dude, what is this? And I'm like, what do you mean? Well, that's the wrong horn. This is supposed to have a Nathan 5 chime on it. And you've got a, whatever, 3 chime, whatever on it. So that made me feel kind of bad. So I grew up in the WWE attitude era of life, the Stone Cold Steve Austin flying the middle finger in the air kind of thing. So I had that attitude, and I'm like, well, you know what? I'm going to come up with my own thing, and you people can't tell me I'm wrong. So I sat down with one of my friends, Bruce Warren, that worked on the railroad with me, and he's like, well, big boy, you got to figure out what you want to do. I said, well, I'm a big Southern Railway fan. I love high hoods. I want the high hood to be my choice of locomotive and kind of follow a little bit of Norfolk Southern with high halogen -9 headlights, that kind of thing. But I didn't want to be restricted to just a prototype. And he's like, well, what are you going to call it? So we worked for a month on a name, and I was doing everything in my power to avoid stealing like somebody else's name or paint scheme. And years ago, when I was 16, I came up with Jellicoe District, which is what Norfolk Southern called the area where I'm from. So I created like a tan and black with red pinstripe Jellicoe District. I had I think it was a Jeep 35 and a Jeep 40. And of course, my painting skills were garbage back then. So that got scrapped. And he's like, well, just go with that. And I said, no, I want a little bit bigger of a railroad. And I was watching Kansas City Southern videos from Pentrax at the time. And I'm like, this Kansas City Southern, they're like a little class 1 gritty, break out the gloves. Let's fight for our work here. Let's get customers. And, they got all this different trackage that's just a montage just thrown together. And I'm like, that's kind of what I want. We're just a spinoff of all these big railroads, and we're left to fend for ourselves, which is really what a short line is. And I told Bruce, I said, I want something that we gather up all these little short lines in Tennessee. Let's put them on a big umbrella. So I said, well, my favorite team's the Tennessee Volunteers. So we're going to take the Tennessee part. Southern Railway is my favorite railroad. We're going to call it the Tennessee Southern Railway. Not railroad, railway. So we started working on a logo and a paint scheme. And there was a HLCX locomotive that I'd just seen in Tennessee that I took a photo of. It was gray and black. And I'm like, kind of boring, but kind of cool in a way. You don't see that paint job as often. So we went with gray and black, and we had Tennessee Southern spelled out on the side with a strike through. It was Gothic lettering with the strike through. And I take the first locomotive, which was a SD9 2142 to this Columbus Model Railroad Club. And the logo looked like the Tennessee Central logo in a way. how the C was centered on the T, except ours was a S, and with the Gothic style lettering, it looked like a dollar sign. I'm like, dude, this just fits perfect. Railroads are all about the money. Right there's the dollar sign. So I'm running this 2142 around. A few people are just kind of eyeballing it, and all the two major people that were just busting my chops over prototypical operations and everything, they're just eyeballing the hell out of it. And they're like, that's kind of cool, but you could do this and you could do that. Then you started to say something else. I'm like, stop, know your role here. That's my railroad. You ain't got nothing to say. So just let it go.
So freelance, out of a kind of a protest for these rivet counters that are kind of picking you apart, and it allows you to kind of do what you want. And I'm just going back. I mean, you unpacked a lot right there in the last few minutes that I want to kind of dive into, which is really cool. Let's start back in, when you were talking about your family and the bloodline. You said you had great uncles, your great grandfather in the railroad and whatnot. What lines were they working for? What kind of family history you got there as far as what they were doing? I'm kind of curious about that.
So on the Jones side, which is my mother's side, her grandfather, M.T. Jones, he was a station agent and clerk for the Louisville and Nashville Railroad. He finally retired at Williamsburg, Kentucky. That was his last post, but he held a lot of different positions throughout Tennessee and Kentucky. His father also was a station agent as well. I never got to meet him, but my grandfather, M.T., he always played music, and he would sit out around the depot playing a banjo and everything and hand orders up to the crew. So a lot of those guys, when I started hanging around him about age 14, a lot of the crews knew him that was passing by on CSX, so they'd toot the horn or they'd stop in the siding there at Saxton, Kentucky, and I get up on the locomotives and look around. And then I met Ron Flannery through my grandfather. He did some articles on him for L&N Historical Society. My papa, Dillis Sharp, he worked as a laborer on a track gang for a short period of time for L&N. So Jellicoe is kind of unique. L&N ran through to a place called Lot, Kentucky, L-O-T. And what they would do with the passenger trains, they would shove into Jellicoe, which is about 2 miles, to Jellicoe Union Station. So that trackage was jointly owned by the L&N and the Southern. So he worked on that section gang, maintaining that part of the line. His son-in-law, Paul Fredericks, he worked for the CNO and the B&O at different times in Toledo, Ohio, and over in Dayton, Ohio, which is part of the railroad line that I've worked through, which is, kind of comes full circle. It's like,
Yeah.
I was always aggravating him, like, hey, you got to get me on a railroad, So he's like, hey, you go up to Ohio, that's where all the business is. And, but my Uncle Eddie Jones, he was one of the biggest influences on me in my life as far as career and how to head. Two things. He hired out Seaboard Coastline down in Florida, and he was the engineer, then eventually is promoted to road foreman of engines on the Clinchville Railroad out of Abbeville, South Carolina. And he exercised his seniority to go back to the craft and finished up his career in Lakeland, Florida, Mulberry area, hauling phosphate. So,
wow.
And they're all gone now, and I'm the last of the Mohicans, so to speak.
Well, you're carrying the torch of a really strong railroading past. That is really phenomenal story for sure, and all that influence that was going on you. And I'm kind of curious because you did pick up the Southern, and I kind of seen and have a kind of a fascination of sorts when I've been in the Carolinas, and of course YouTube and some old Southern stuff and the high hood stuff and the long hood forward and all the kind of cool stuff that that's trademark of the Southern. And it sounds like you got to see quite a bit of that as well.
Angelico was mostly all Southern. Whenever we'd go to Corbin, Kentucky, you'd basically drive right alongside the L&N. So I get to see some CSX stuff every now and then whenever I was a kid, but the Southern stuff was just cool. The tuxedo scheme.
Right.
And I just remember that distinct sound of that 5-chime horn. And that I was just hooked from a kid on.
And the access you were getting, I mean, to be able to, 5 years old, ride on a caboose to, in your teens, being able to climb on equipment and check all that stuff out. That's an era gone by now, but certainly an awesome opportunity for you. And I can see how that seed got planted in you about railroading and model railroading.
And what's cool, that caboose that I got to ride on was assigned to that job. And Norfolk Southern, when they retired it sits in my hometown.
Oh, awesome.
So that kind of came full circle. And I went back home one time, they started to paint it blue. And the mayor at the time was my high school principal. Yeah. And I'm like, there ain't no way in hell you're painting this blue. So I went and got him a photo. I convinced everybody to stop painting. I went and talked to the mayor. He drove up with me. He's like, I think we really need to restore this to historical purposes, Yeah. So it got repainted red. They screwed up the lettering, but, you got to live with what you can. So it's not blue.
Well, it sounds like you got to take your principal to school and teach him a little history. And it's good that he at least listened to about as much as he could there. And, although they got the lettering wrong, still better than painting it a false color. So really, really cool stuff and a great. And then I want to ask about this club, because I'm a proponent of, getting in the hobby, getting in a club. And that sounds like kind of what you did there. So say the name of the club again.
It was the Columbus, Ohio Model Railroad Club. They're no longer around. A group spun off from that called the Central Ohio Model Railroad Club. And they meet on the north side of town. I haven't been to that club, but maybe once or twice. So a lot of good guys there.
Well, it sounds like you got in there and, when they started rivet counting you start this freelance thing. And what were some of the good takeaways from being a member of that club?
Well, I met a lot of good people in that club. Mr. Adams, like I said, I would hang out with him and his kids because they were my age. Met a friend named Kevin Tweed there, Andy Chabot, exceptional modelers. Those guys know more about trains than I've learned in 20-something years. They just have it memorized, like they eat, sleep, breathe trains. So they're good guys, and I asked them questions. And so the big thing about a model railroad club that I took away, because when you get a big group of people, you got good and you got bad. And there's a lot of politics. And at the time, being 20 years old, 21, I didn't care for politics and that kind of thing. But I met some good friends. One, Doug Hannon, he invited me over to his house, and he was super detailing engines. And I just sat down with him one evening, just watched him work. He's like, here's what you need to do. Here's the type of drill bit you use. Show me some tricks. And that's when I started getting into the detailing portion. But met a lot of good friends, lifetime friendships out of that. That would be the biggest takeaway. Right now, I've been visiting the Zane Trace Model Railroad Club, which is just east of me. Great group of guys. Everybody gets along. Smooth running Layout. Brian Harrier, yeah, he's a great person. He's president of the club. They do operations. It's a fantastic layout. And, everybody contributes something to it. And the camaraderie there is just unbelievable. So I really like going to that club.
Like I said before, I'm a big proponent of clubs, especially getting started in the hobby, or, if you don't have something of your own and you can get connected, like every, human driven thing, there's always sometimes the politics. And you mentioned that 21, you're not interested in the politics. Well, me at 44, I'm not really interested in the politics either, right? You just want to be able to come enjoy and and be able to run a train. But hey, sometimes that happens in human interaction. But glad that you're able to reconnect with another club and you got some good friendships out of it, which is certainly one of the great things of being a member of a club. So when do you start breaking out on your own?
It took a while to bloom into a layout because I really wasn't sure the trajectory in which I wanted to take it. I lived with my friend Kevin Tweed there for a while and rented a room off him back in the single days. And he had all these books. And I was never happy with the gray and black paint scheme after I saw it run for a while. So the BNSF, they had painted the two-tone, two-sided SD60M. So I really liked that orange because Tennessee orange wasn't readily available, and that color is a pain in the rear to mix. So I kind of went with the Great Northern Orange, and that's what we call our Heritage 1 scheme. And Kevin had gave me a Rail Power SD90 Mac for my birthday, and it had Overland Drive under it. He's like, hey, come up with a new paint scheme, just make it cool and you can have this. If you don't make it cool, something's going to happen,
It's going to get revoked. Yeah.
Yeah. So I took one of his BNSF books, looked at it, studied, and we came up with a different paint job, applied it. So it was orange, black, and single red stripe. So fast forward a couple of years, 2006, I was married again at that time. We bought a house and started building the layout. Basically, that house was built for the basement and for the layout.
And everything else was just a feature to keep it dry, huh?
Yeah, the rule of thumb was, everything from the basement stairs down, that's my domain. Everything above that, you do whatever you want. I'll just mow the grass, right? So, and she was cool with it. But the logo, I kind of wanted to update that. So she helped me out with that, and I kept coming up with this slanted T thing. Just couldn't get it right. So she just walks in. We were having the house built at the time. I'm sitting in my little train room in our 2-bedroom apartment. She's like, why don't you just wrap the S around it, kind of like the staff on the emergency services. And so it just kind of clicked over in my head. I'm like, yeah, that's a good idea. Just stretch everything out. And that's how the new logo evolved. Anything in this hobby, especially freelance, it's evolving. Railroad is evolving. It's just continuous evolution in this industry. And that's kind of the way I looked at the hobby. So I started coming up with a different paint scheme. I couldn't get the orange right still. And so I just went with the Southern Tuxedo. I'm like, hey, this is easy to do. Take all the Southern stuff off, slap my own stuff on. But then I felt like a copycat. And by the time, I started feeling this way, we're in a new house. And I didn't like the side lettering on the locomotive because it was just plain Jane lettering. And I'm like, man, this just isn't cool enough and isn't where I want it. So I think for 3 months, me and some friends just kept working on different paint jobs. And we came up with some cool stuff, but nothing hit. Then one day I was looking at the EMD demonstrator paint scheme on a Jeep 60. And I'm like, yeah, if you kind of turn that a little bit, change the colors from one end, it kind of looks like Southern Railway unit. Got that blue band around it with a black stripe. That's imitation aluminum with a yellow stripe. Reverse the white with black. Yeah, that's the look I'm going for. So we started with a Jeep 40X. Those units had just came out at the time. And I'm like, this is going to be the first one. We're going to start giving this railroad a backstory now. So it's a spinoff of the Southern and the L&N, early 80s, late 70s. We're going to get some of these locomotives to kind of give us some credibility, like, hey, the Southern handed this down to us. The L&N gave this to us. Later, CSX Norfolk Southern. So I started modeling the units per prototype, but in my paint scheme. So hence, Proto Freelance evolves. So we took his Jeep 40X, changed the EMD demonstrator paint job, the angle on the locomotive, the height of the stripe on the bottom, and the height of the black. So if you notice with the TS paint job, all the units, the black runs underneath the radiator grills on the EMDs. And it always, the angle starts the third door on the long hood end. It goes at a 47-degree angle, and it goes up to the roof and wraps around. So everybody thought that was cool. We added the white stripes. Tamiya made the actual legitimate Tennessee orange, matches perfect.
Nice.
And that's the paint I use. So I was stoked. We got the logo, and I'm just watching football one evening on ESPN. I'm like, you know what? I wonder, instead of centering the Tennessee Southern on the long hood, let's just kind of shift that toward the rear end and take this ESPN font because it looks like it's just flying. So I'm like, yeah, here we go. And I had an Alps printer, so going to school for CAD and everything, I just boom, out it comes.
Nice.
And I'm like, yeah, now we're cooking with gas. And always wanted to pay some type of tribute to our servicemen and women. So if you notice on all Tennessee Southern engines, there's an American flag.
Very cool.
So the BN, if you look at where they put their flags, that's where I took that. So a little bit of a evolution and kind of an identifier. Freight locomotives on the TS, all the flags are completely straight, and they're oriented by the front of the locomotive, which designation with the F. Right. So our high hood units, they're long hood forward lead. So the flag's flipped.
Okay. Yep.
So our faster geared locomotives for intermodal, auto racks, that kind of thing, because we class our locomotives for the gear ratio to haul the specific freight. So like a Jeep 60, if you look at photos in the TS group, you'll notice all the flags are waving. That's to make it look like, hey, we got some speed and we're just hauling rear end here, you know? Cool. So that's kind of just one of those little tidbits that we do.
That's awesome. You got all these small stories and, things that you've done that you've been able to incorporate into this story. And as you're talking about freelance, I'm kind of curious, was there anything prior to this idea of other than, protesting against the rivet counters that was inspiring you as far as freelance goes? Other freelance railroads that were kind of inspiration to you at all?
Yeah. Alan McClelland, the VNO layout, that was the first freelance that I recall seeing in a model railroader. And I'm like, man, this guy's stuff is cool. And I'm thankful later on, whenever I moved to Ohio, he only lived like an hour and a half from me. I actually got to see his later layout and got to talk to him for a while. And that was just like meeting one of your heroes.
I'm sure, yeah.
But one of the big ones, Jim Whitaker, is Ohio Southern. I really like that layout. The Utah Belt, I really enjoyed how he kept his locomotives and that continued evolution of the industry going. Now, with the hobby as expensive as it's getting, that's kind of difficult to do sometimes. TS 1.0 kept up with the modern times. TS 2.0, I'm rolling the clock back because that era between 1996 and 2006, I really enjoyed railroading during that period of time. I was still a teenager, and then I was on a railroad, and I got to see some of the rainbow-colored locomotives still. There was still some Seaboard system, chassis, Conrail, all that. So, but those three freelance railroads, that's really what got me going. They had freedom, and that's what I like about the freelance.
I'm just amazed, and it kind of, I've mentioned this before, and as I interview freelance model railroaders such as yourself, kind of, tickle some things that I like too, logo design and paint scheme design. And it's just everything. I mean, just beyond just, everything is in your control. And it's just a wild idea to be able to do that and create your own story. And again, I've always thought it was pretty easy, but I see that, you've got to create every single element of your story. It's not like you can just take and rip chapters out of a real book. It's, you've got to create quite a bit of this and make it your own.
Well, I wanted to make it believable and I wanted to make it credible. Like, hey, this railroad could actually exist.
Right.
And since then, like I've got one of my good friends, Dennis Blake. I've been helping build his layout. He was originally going to build the Seaboard, and then he kind of started kicking around the idea of a freelance after I was designing his layout. And I said, man, have you ever seen this TN tower in Tampa? He's like, oh, yeah, that's a cool tower. And I'm like, yeah, I kind of want to build that. And he's like, you know what? I should do something like your TS, come up with my own thing. We'll call it Tampa Northern. So that evolved. And so I drew the logo out, what he wanted. So his slogan is Pines to Palms. So I get with Hank Stevens. He changes a couple of things on the design, formats it to where we can have a logo. And that's how the Tampa Northern was born. And I think he's really enjoying it because he's got freedom, right? He's not restricted to the prototype, but he can still have the prototype there. It's all about that freedom.
Yeah, it's wildly fascinating to me to be able to do that and have that. I'm not sure what my next one will be, but boy, I'm starting to lean. The needle's starting to head towards that freelance side, just from the excitement that you guys bring to the hobby. Again, tickles a whole lot of those really neat interests. And it sounds like for you, that was, between logo design and, paint schemes. And then are you painting your locomotives too?
I do my own painting. Yes.
Nice. Talk about that process, because it's not the easiest thing in the world to do. Tell us about your kind of, learning that.
Well, my friend Bruce Warren, I learned how to airbrush from him. He used to custom paint all his locomotives. Before we had FURX locomotives in production or Alstom rebuilds, he was painting those left and right for people. So I learned a lot from him and my friend Doug Hannon about painting, Benny Adams as well. And just, go to the hobby shop. That's the great thing about brick and mortar hobby shops.
Yeah.
Everybody has a different skill. And model railroaders and railroaders are the best thieves ever. You steal something from everybody and you create your own style. So I created a universal template for mine on some drawings, and that way everything lines up on the ends. So I use those templates. I wash my locomotives, detail them out, primer. It usually takes about 3 coats of orange paint to get the shade right. I let that set up and cure. Then I mask everything off with the templates and shoot my black. And then I do all the pinstriping, which the pinstriping takes forever. So normally it takes me about 2-3 weeks to paint one up because I like all the little fine details, the warning labels, like the auto start, knuckle holder, whatever the case may be.
Yeah, rivet counting stuff.
Yeah.
Exactly.
The stuff I rebelled against. Now I'm part of it.
But it's yours, and that's so fun. That's really cool. Before we get too far away from the Tennessee Southern 1.0, I want you to tell us a little bit about it, because when you told me the dimensions, my eyes got big, and you certainly had something really big underway. Tell us about how that worked, track plan, and what you were doing with it. How far did you get?
Well, we completed. We were probably 95% complete when we tore it down and I moved. So since then, I got divorced and now I'm on my own, got my own place. So 2.0 is going to be a little bit smaller, but it's going to be more refined and different. But 1.0, I wanted hill helpers and operations. So the original track plan, Jellicoe was the middle part of dead center. Knoxville was the southernmost terminus. What we call North Middlesboro was the northern part, which that was staging for like Cincinnati, Lexington, Paducah, Kentucky. So everything was intended to be divided. And at the time, my friend Kevin, he invited me to go to Holly, Michigan, which is just north of Detroit, to visit Larry Burke. And I have to tell this part of the story because of how the operations and how everything came full circle on 1.0. Even with all the railroad knowledge that I had at the time, it still wasn't, I wasn't able to convey that knowledge to somebody that did not work in the industry. Mm. And what I was trying to do, people are like, dude, I don't get this. So a little bit of a learning curve. I'd never done operations. And then I visited Larry Burke's Clinch Valley, which is a freelance of basically the Clinchfield Railroad and some other parts. And Larry and I started talking, and he modeled part of Knoxville. So now this friendship starts growing, and I started looking at the operations that he was doing, and he would take me around. And he was a professional railroader as well. He's like, here's the car card system. Here's what I do one for one. You could do this, you could do that. And I'm like, oh man, these are great ideas. I'm writing them down. So I took his operating scheme, added it to mine, and everything started running smooth at that point. So Jellicoe became the base for the mine runs, and those cars would go north to the coal fields. They would switch out the various coal mines, bring the loads back to Jellicoe. That was, in a sense, a marshaling yard. And there was one coal mine that we did unit trains. So real railroading, you got quirks in different areas, like there's 4-axle limitations, 6-axle bands, whatever the case may be.
Right.
So our unit train came out of Knoxville with empties, 2 6-axles on the head end. The operator would leave Knoxville, run the whole course of the layout, pull into staging, cut the 6-axles off, and wait. 4-axles would come out, load the train, swap back out with the locomotives, and they'd haul that to the power plant with the new operator. So that's a little bit of a prototype operation conveyed down to the model railroad world. And whenever we would get enough coal cars in Jellicoe, we'd call up light power out of Knoxville, run that power up to Jellicoe, grab those loads up, take them to the power plant, or shift them in different cars for metallurgical coal. No, only one local came out of Knoxville and switched the terminal. I had like 3 industries it switched. Every now and then it would switch to TVA power plant. I had a 6-foot long bridge that was the Tennessee River, loosely based on the prototype that goes across in front of Neyland Stadium. And I went and took photos from the Gay Street Bridge and did like a panoramic shot from the bridge all the way across from one end to the other. So that was the backdrop.
Nice. Everybody
loved that scene. And when that got torn down, and I posted on Facebook that I've scratched that scene, it's not going to be in the new operating plan, I started getting hate mail for that. I'm like, man, I didn't think it was that good of a scene. I can do better now. Everybody's like, oh, you got to bring that back. So I'm trying to fit that in on 2.0. I think I got that dialed in finally, so that will be back on 2.0. So I Everybody stop with the hate mail there.
You're a people pleaser. Yeah, that's, you gotta give the fans what they want, and they want that bridge back. That's awesome. That 6 foot long. That's incredible. That's one heck of a bridge.
Yeah, that was fun to build. It was actually built out of Kato end scale bridges, and we cut the ends off, flipped it upside down, added micro engineering bridge shoes to it, added a couple little plastic pieces to make it look right, and yeah, it looked close enough.
Awesome.
And but continuing north out of Knoxville, I had a seam divide from that bridge. Then you end up in Newcomb, Tennessee, which is about 57 miles north of that area. So you had a passing siding there that was the longest one on the layout. So you could pass about 17 feet of train. We had one industry there called Kenny Hill Propane, which you heard me talk about Benny and Jesse Adams. Jesse's brother, Kenny Adams, was one of my good friends. He helped do all the electrical work. And in 2009, he was killed in a motorcycle accident.
Oh, sorry to hear that.
So we decided to do a little tribute because at the time it was going to be a prank. We'd actually found a model of his car, and so we were going to prank him because it kind of looked like Bobby Hill from King of the Hill. And we'd always tease him. And so I created some decals. We did 3 tank cars, one for me, one for Jesse, and one for Benny. And they all had, significant dates to them that the family would know. And we used his phone number for the sign on the building, and we called it Kenny Hill Propane and Propane Accessories. And I'd asked Jess, I said, I hate to ask, but are we still doing this? It was kind of to poke fun at him, but now it's like, what do you do? And he's like, no, we're going with it. It's going to be a tribute.
Nice.
And Jesse really helped me build the layout from start to finish. My friend JJ Lewis helped out, and Dennis Blake. And so we've done a lot of tributes over the years. We did that tribute for Kenny, our friend JP. There's one Conrail locomotive that's painted Conrail, but sublettered Tennessee Southern. And JP was a Steelers fan, so we've got him in these bib overalls with the yellow Steelers shirt and that Steelers hat. So,
that's awesome.
That it comes full circle, right? The camaraderie of this hobby is the best part of it. You make lifelong friends. And I think the younger generation, they're starting to see that, those people that get into it. And I hope they understand, that's where the fun is for everything in it. But that was one of the tributes. But back to the layout. So you got Kenny Hill Propane that would hold 2 propane tank cars. You would go from there. There's a coal mine called Triple I Coal, which is a actual coal mine in that area. That area was modeled to the prototype as much as I could. Then you circle around to a place called Oswego, and you're still on the top portion of the layout. And the intent in that area in real life, they wanted to do an industrial park, but a lot of people that were contributing funds to that kind of backed out. Jellicoe didn't have the best workforce. It was hard to get supplies, I guess. So they backed out. But our story is we came along, we helped create this industrial park. So in real life, I switched to a place in Martell, Ohio called Pillsbury. And what they do, they make biscuits for KFC, cookie dough, all kinds of stuff. And so I took what I learned there, switching that plant, put it to the layout. So you had 2 tracks for sugar. Of course, that comes in an air slide covered hopper. They got grain, so that came in a standard covered hopper. And you had specific spots that you had to switch. So On that same lead, you had Buffalo Industries, which was a paper receiving place that made cardboard boxes, and that's based on a paper plant in Marion, Ohio. On the back side against the wall, I did a shallow, low relief building called I-75 Cold Storage, and that received reefer cars. That building's based on a building here in Columbus, Ohio that we used to switch off the Scottsdale Secondary. And then continuing north on the single track, you would go underneath the staircase to a siding called Adams. At Adams, we added a coal mine. The passing siding there, that led you into Jellicoe Yard, and you had a place called Cantrell, which Cantrell was a actual business back home that made pipe fittings and different brass products. So that place has been long out of business. We made it a plastic manufacturing, whatever they made. They just got plastic cars. So you had Jellicoe Yard, you had a station, the main street. I actually modeled those buildings in various stages. I found some photos from the 50s and 60s of buildings in Jellicoe, and I took those photos and created some of those buildings. So in some form or fashion, that Jellicoe Main Street is prototypical in various eras from the 50s all the way to the 2000s. From there, you go back into single track. You came around, we had a working defect detector that everybody hated because that would just throw a monkey wrench into everything. And everybody would have to wait, and somebody always ran through a switch and would have a derailment every time that thing would. They'd have to shove back in the yard and set the bad order out. From there, you had a siding on top of the helix. That was Lot and Holton, which those are actually prototypical names. Lot is where the Southern in real life would come on to CSX, and they had trackage rights to a place called Holton, which Holton actually makes a Y. And that takes you all the way up to Fondee, Kentucky, where the coal mines were. So in our world, we kept going straight and blasted through the mountain to get to North Middlesboro, so to access the other coal mines. So you spiral down the helix, you pop out, there's a single track load out for coal. You're going down a 2.5% grade, and you're just winding through a little canyon type thing with a river. And then you come into North Middlesboro. That's where staging yard begins. There's a coal yard there for 2 unit trains, and there's a lead. So the coal trains, they would enter this yard, and the mine run or somebody working the mine job would do all the work. And the rest of the junk freight, as we call it, would either enter staging loop to turn back, or they would get switched out.
Wow. This is all in what you said, 38 by 24 double deck.
Yep.
A lot of railroad. There was something you did say, and I wanted to ask you. You mentioned the bakery, and you talked about, in real life switching a similar operation out and what you learned. And I'm curious, as a real railroader doing model railroading, is it harder at times knowing what you know about prototypical operations to come into the model railroad and try to apply it? Because sometimes I know real railroading doesn't always really apply 100% into model railroading. Do you find that to be a challenge at all?
Sometimes, yes. To work on a railroad, you got to have a skill level. I mean, you learn from previous railroaders, you go to school for it, and you just got to, I don't know how to explain that. You got to look at the operations, everything, because there's a cause and a reason why this car's got to go here. So, like the Pillsbury, The inside track was for the air slides. Well, all that product, it's closer to the silos, so it pumps out, and there's where the pressure pump is and everything. So that's kind of one of those little things that you pick up on. The granary, you got to shoot because it's bottom drop carb, right? So that's going to go into a different area. So stuff like that. When you go to somebody's house and you run their railroad, you don't want to be a jerk and go, hey, you really wouldn't do that in real life. Yeah. I mean, that's sometimes the hard part, and you just enjoy it. But, a lot of times, if the operator knows, or the owner knows rather, that you're a railroader, they'll ask, hey, what do you think of this?
Now, I think sometimes it's that inside baseball stuff that you get to know because you're in the industry. And, for us, that aren't in the industry, or at least I'll speak for myself. Sometimes I'm guessing based on what I observe in the real world. And I found that the more I'm in the field trying to watch the prototype, the less I really understand it. It's like, why are they doing it? It's like, and then, it's got to make sense. They keep doing it, right? Unless, they're a railroad that doesn't want to make money or got employees that aren't following, procedure or something. But, it's like, it's so you as a model railroader, a lot of times I just guess, okay, this must be what they're doing. But, I'd be honored to have a real railroader come over and, smack me on the backside of the head and say, you could do this better and make it more realistic. But I'm sure sometimes you have to even suspend that because of just compression and everything else.
Yeah. And that's what I'm having a difficult time with designing 2.0, because I've got it in my head now. I got to have prototypical operations because that's what I like.
Yeah.
And I'm not able to make that work in certain areas. So I'm having to make those compromises, and that's difficult for me. But to your point about the real railroads, looking at an operation going, man, that makes no sense. I'm here to tell you, us railroaders actually say that every day. Why in the world are you running this train this direction when you could go this way, save 2 crews, save motive power, less handling of the cars? But some bean counter in some headquarters is going, nope, this saves us 10 cents. In reality, you're stepping over $10 to pick up a dime.
So what you're saying is that the job that most of us fantasize about in the end is still a job.
Yes, absolutely.
So before we have to wrap up here, I want to get a little bit into 2.0, and it certainly is clear that I'm going to have you back here to talk a lot more. And as sure as you're, building, the Tennessee Southern 2.0, we're going to learn a lot about it. But give us a summary of what you've got planned for the 2.0 version of this layout.
So 2.0, we're going to roll the clock back. I'm not a big fan of PTC era stuff. All the antennas in the system really doesn't work the way it should in the real world. And, everything's 6 axles right now. To me, it's just kind of bland railroading. Every time I go rail fanning, I'm seeing an ES44, SD70 Ace, M-2, whatever.
Right.
Nothing's wrong with that. If that's your thing, that's your thing. But I'm kind of getting into more the old school stuff like Jeep 7Us that Athearn just announced. We're going to pick up a couple of those and paint them orange. Jeep 10s, Jeep 16s. I've seen a couple of those run, and I just think that's the coolest thing ever. They sound neat. So right. 2.0 is going to be Knoxville Terminal. Essentially, the Tennessee Southern operates the entire terminal, which in the real world, Knoxville and Holston River Railroad actually operates at. So we're going to have the Tennessee River Bridge. The main line running is going to be kept to a bare minimum. What I've got designed right now is going to be 3 decks. It's a lot smaller space than what we did have, because now the minimum aisle width is going to be 3.5 feet, and it's going to branch out to 4 to 6 feet. So I kind of want some space. I want everybody to be able to relax. If you want to run a mainline train, you'll go out of staging, loop up one level, work the whole deck, spiral back down into staging. There will be 1 yard there, Coster Yard, which actually used to be a wheel shop for the Southern Railway, which is also the primary yard for Knoxville and Holston River Railroad now. That yard is going to be our switching yard. You'll have a guy, Randy Tell. I went to his layout, got some ideas from him and Corey Lucius a couple of weeks ago, and they converted their layout to a single deck and did operating zones, which is what I'm going to do with this one. So you'll have a yard guy working that yard. He'll build 2 different locals. You'll have one guy switching the town. You'll have one guy that'll go out to the Holston River Industrial Park, which that'll go through a helix to the upper level. So that's going to be a branch line all to itself, and that's going to be our access to North Carolina. So we're going to have a little bit of staging there somewhere, and high Clinch Valley trains, which Larry Burke's railroad became part of the TS. So we're going to have that incorporated somehow in that area. So a lot of industrial switching, a lot of 4-axles, a lot of NP15s, SW1500s. So it's going to be a lot of switching, and it's going to be fun.
Yeah, sounds like it. Good to have a lot of switching, and you're able to take some of what you had. You're meeting your fans' demand of keeping the bridge scene in there, so that's always important. But yeah, I'm looking forward. How much construction do you have on the 2.0 done so far?
We're still in the drawing phase at the moment.
Okay, yeah.
So there's
an important phase for sure.
Yeah. So I bought this condo. It's got a full basement in it. We got to knock out one wall and a quarter of another wall to make this work.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, my first goal is to get the shop up and running. I'm dying to paint some engines. I really haven't touched anything since 2020. So I've been on a long hiatus. So I've got the itch.
Good. The hiatus is coming to an end. We're going to knock some walls down. We'll get the Tennessee Southern back up and running. It'll be fun to watch, and we'll definitely be getting you back on here to talk about that. And we're going to follow that journey. A couple ways to do that. You got a Facebook group. We'll put the link up there. And then you also have your YouTube channel that you've been sharing quite a bit of information on. That's at 10 TENN South 5150. I ask, is 5150 a Van Halen reference?
Absolutely.
Nice. Good work there. Before we wrap up here on Around the Layout, I do have to ask you about this PS 4427 car that you did with Chris. Talk about how you hook up with Mr. Palmieri and how you end up with the Tennessee Southern out and available for anybody to put on their layout.
Well, my friend Joe Bohannon, which owns the Chinook Lines, I should say, he actually visited my layout. He enjoyed it, and he reached out and he's like, "Hey, I'm thinking about talking to Chris about your railroad. What do you think?" I said, "Yeah, if he reaches out, I'll think about it," because I've always been I hold the TS close to the chest kind of thing. And so Chris reached out and he's like, "Hey, what do you think?" Originally, it was going to be a 86-foot box car. We had pitched some ideas of an orange car with Tennessee checkerboard on the ends, kind of like our football stadium has checkerboard end zone. So that design was pretty cool. He's like, "Well, what do your covered hoppers look like?" I said, "Well, they're kind of bland, straight gray, black lettering. I'm cheap, do what's accessible."
Sure.
And so he's like, "Well, look through Tangent's catalog there." And I'm like, I kind of like this two-tone color here. I think it was Illinois Central car, I think. And I said, that's kind of neat. And I said, I don't have any two-tones, so this would be kind of neat. And he's like, yeah. So he always does something for the owner of the railroad, which I thought was neat, that because railroads are owned by a trust or a lease company, whatever, with the equipment. So up in the top left-hand corner, if you look, the full railroad's name, which I kind of stole from the Murphy Branch book in the Southern Railway that came out years ago, they actually had a North Carolina and Tennessee Southern Railroad. And I'm like, that just kind of makes you sound high class. So we threw that in there with ownership of Clyde Whitaker Bank and Trust, Jellicoe, Tennessee. So that's a neat thing for the owner,
That's awesome.
And Chris was great to work with. I'd never done anything like that. I only bounced the artwork back a couple of times, and the Tangent just knocked that car out of the park. I was very concerned about how the lettering on the side of the car, because that's one of only a few cars that actually says Tennessee Southern on the side. And I kind of steered clear of that because of how the lettering overlaps the ribs, and it makes that font look goofy. But they nailed it. And those cars were a lot better than I expected. Some of my friends, like Andy Chabot, he just lives down the street from me. He got one, weathered the heck out of it, and patched it. My friend Brandon Townley did a shot of it with his modular piece, and he weathered the cars and did kind of like a repatch of the same number, which was really neat to see. Like, it had been tagged and or been in a wreck and had some repairs. So it's really neat to see what everybody's done with it. But as far as the home shops concept, I think Chris is really onto something there. I wish some of the other companies would do some locomotives, hint to scale trains, SD 40-3 and Tennessee Orange, hint, hint, hint.
They're from Tennessee. That I think it'd only be fitting for them to do something.
Yeah, it saved me a lot of work too.
Oh, that's fantastic. Yeah, that's one thing I can say. Chris Palmieri, I'm just so excited to follow along Home Shops and see what he's up to next. He's got a lot of great, and he works with such great vendors like Tangent. I mean, Tangent, just the quality of their product is just phenomenal, and for him to be connected with them and get a project like we got with the PS 4427s, just a great car, and really cool idea to be able to share your freelance railroad around the world.
Yeah, I've got a lot of compliments on it. It just, I am honored that he chose me to be in the group I was with. I mean, the Cat Mountain Santa Fe, the Allagash, those guys, their railroads are top notch. Yeah. And to be in that group, I was like, oh man, feel like I'm on top of the world. So
yeah, you're right there with them. That's very cool. So Alan, it was so awesome getting to hear your model railroad story, and we're going to definitely get you back here. And as you complete the Tennessee Southern 2.0 version of your layout and get that up and running, I'm really interested to see what you get going for operations on that as well. The prototype railroading in your life and influencing your model railroading is certainly a cool story to hear, and look forward again to having you back here on Around the Layout.
Absolutely. Appreciate it.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of Around the Layout. Learn more about today's show on our Facebook page, facebook.com/Around the Layout. Show your support by becoming an operating crew member at patreon.com/Around the Layout podcast. Past episodes and more can be found on our website, aroundthelayout.com. And send us your feedback, aroundthelayout@gmail.com. Thanks for hanging out with us around the layout.